A hiker looks at a map. A marked X leads to a body missing for 20 years. The stale air of the attic tasted of dead things and forgotten time. Dust motes, thick as summer gnats, danced in the single beam of Ilias's headlamp, a frantic, silent ballet in the oppressive dark. He wasn't supposed to be up here. His daughter Sarah had been clear. "Dad, just pack the essentials. The movers will handle the rest." But essentials to Sarah were photo albums and tax returns. Essentials to Elias were the ghosts he'd spent a lifetime collecting. The artifacts of a life lived mostly in the shadow of mountains. And the most important ghosts were always stored in the highest, most inaccessible places. He ran a gloved hand over a stack of old topographical maps, their edges brittle and yellowed. The smell of aging paper and ink filled his nostrils, a scent more comforting to him than any perfume. These were his real family portraits, the crinkled faces of the Sierras, the Rockies, the Appalachians. Each contour line was a memory, each trail a story. He'd spent 40 years as a search and rescue volunteer. A wilderness guide, a man who understood the language of the wild better than the language of his own home. His wife Maria had called the mountains his mistress. After she was gone, they became his only confidant. He pulled a heavy rolled-up tube from the bottom of a dusty wooden crate. It was heavier than the others, bound not with a rubber band, but with a cracked leather cord. He didn't recognize it at first. Most of his maps were neatly filed, labeled with the name of the national park and the year of the expedition. This one was an outlier, an orphan. He untied the cord, the lever flaking under his touch, and unrolled the map across the dusty floorboards. It was a custom job, not a standard USGS survey. The paper was thicker, almost like parchment, and the details were hand-drawn with a cartographer's precision, but also with an artist's soul. It depicted a remote, notoriously difficult section of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana, a place known for its sudden violent storms and its labyrinthine network of unnamed canyons. Elias knew it well. He'd led a dozen search parties through that unforgiving terrain, more often than not returning with grim news. His eyes traced the familiar ridges, the jagged teeth of the peaks, the delicate blue veins of the creeks. Then he saw it, a small, perfect X, drawn in what looked like faded red ink, just off a barely there game trail, deep in a ravine called Sorrow's Gulch, a local name not one you'd find on any official map. Beside the X, in the same faded red, was a date. September 14th, 2004. A cold dread, sharp and sudden as a winter wind, snaked its way up his spine. It wasn't the X itself that was so jarring. Hikers and hunters marked maps all the time a good fishing spot, a hidden spring, a place where they'd spotted a grizzly. It was the date, September 14th, 2004. That was the day, 20-year-old Ben Carter had vanished in that exact section of the Bitterroots. Elias remembered the search like it was yesterday. It had been one of the biggest in the state's history. For 3 weeks, hundreds of volunteers, including a younger, stronger Elias, had combed every inch of that wilderness. They'd found his abandoned tent, a half-eaten granola bar, a single hiking boot stuck in the mud by a riverbank. But they had never found Ben. The official theory was that he'd been swept away by the river. His body carried miles downstream and lost forever. His mother, a fragile bird-like woman named Clara Carter, had refused to believe it. She'd spent her life savings on private investigators, psychics, anyone who would offer a sliver of hope. She'd called Elias every year on the anniversary of Ben's disappearance, her voice a little thinner, a little more brittle each time. "You were the lead volunteer, Mr. Thorne," she'd say, the formality a thin veil over her bottomless grief. "Is there anything you remember? Anything at all?" And every year he'd had to give her the same heartbreaking answer. Now, this map, this X, it felt like a confession. A secret held for 2 decades, hidden in his own attic. But how? He'd never seen this map before in his life. He was sure of it. He turned it over, his heart hammering against his ribs. In the bottom right corner, almost invisible against the aged paper, was a small, embossed seal. A name circled by a wreath of pine branches. Jonathan Westhoff, land surveyor. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Jonathan Westhoff, he'd been on that search, a quiet, intense man, a local property developer who knew the mountains almost as well as Elias did. He'd been one of the most dedicated volunteers, staying out long after others had given up for the day, poring over the maps each night in the command tent. Elias remembered him being particularly interested in Sorrow's Gulch, arguing that they hadn't searched it thoroughly enough. But the dogs had lost the scent near the river, and the consensus had been to focus downstream. Westhoff had eventually, reluctantly, agreed. Coincidence? It had to be. Westhoff was a surveyor. He marked maps for a living. Maybe the X was a geodetic marker, a boundary point. Maybe the date was just a coincidence. But it was too perfect, too neat. A 20-year-old mystery, a missing boy, and a map in his own attic pointing to the exact spot. Marked with the exact date, he disappeared. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, the bright screen a jarring intrusion in the dusty darkness. He Googled Jonathan Westhoff. The first result was a glossy website for Westhoff Development Group, showcasing luxury mountain lodges and sprawling golf courses. The company's slogan was carving paradise from the wilderness. Elias snorted. Vultures were more like it. The second result was an obituary. Jonathan Westhoff had died of a heart attack 2 years ago. He was 65. A dead end, or was it? The obituary mentioned a surviving son, a man named Marcus Westhoff, who had taken over the family business. A new, colder dread began to settle. In Elias's stomach, he knew Marcus. Everyone in the valley knew Marcus. He was the quintessential rich kid, arrogant and reckless. With a string of DUIs and a reputation for treating the town like his personal playground, he'd been about the same age as Ben Carter back in 2004. They'd even been in the same graduating class. Elias's mind raced, connecting dots he hadn't even known existed. The quiet, intense father who insisted on searching a specific ravine. The arrogant, reckless son, a missing boy, and a map that felt less like a guide and more like a tombstone. He had to go. He couldn't call the sheriff. What would he say? I found a Tudor code map in my attic that might lead to a body. They'd think he was a senile old man, confused by the stress of moving. No, this was something he had to do himself. He was a searcher. It was in his blood. He owed it to Clara Carter. He owed it to the ghost of Ben. He rolled the map carefully, tucked it into the inner pocket of his jacket, and descended the attic stairs, his movements slow and deliberate. The weight of the discovery pressing down on him. Sarah was in the kitchen, on the phone with the moving company, her back to him. He slipped out the back door without a word. The drive to the trailhead was a blur of pine trees and asphalt. The Bitterroots loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in a low-hanging mist, looking more ominous than he'd ever seen them. He parked his old pickup truck, the engine sputtering in protest as he turned the key. He pulled on his worn leather hiking boots, grabbed his packaways, kept ready by the door. A habit from his Sardasand, started down the trail. The air was cool and damp. The scent of pine and wet earth a familiar comfort, but today, it did nothing to soothe the frantic beating of his heart. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a footstep behind him. He felt like a trespasser, an intruder in a story that had been waiting 20 years to be told. Sorrow's Gulch was 3 miles in, a steep, treacherous descent off the main trail. The game trail marked on Westhoff's map was barely visible, overgrown with thorny bushes and slick with moss. He had to use his hands to push through the dense undergrowth, the branches scratching at his face and arms. The ravine was darker than the surrounding forest, the canopy of ancient cedars blocking out most of the sunlight. The air grew colder, heavier. A profound, unnatural silence settled over the place. The birds had stopped singing. He checked the map again, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. The X was another 200 yards down, near a distinctive cluster of moss-covered boulders. He pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. And then he saw them. The boulders, shaped like a sleeping giant. exactly as they appeared on the hand-drawn map. He slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. He could smell it now. A faint, cloying sweetness on the air, the smell of decay. He'd smelled it too many times before. It was the smell of death. His gaze swept the area around the boulders. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves, undisturbed for years, perhaps decades. Nothing looked out of place. Nothing looked like a grave. He consulted the map one last time, trying to pinpoint the exact location of the X. It was on the north side of the boulder cluster, in a small, shallow depression. He walked around the massive rocks, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He knelt down, his old knees protesting. He pushed aside the top layer of leaves and pine needles. Underneath, the soil was darker, more loosely packed than the surrounding ground. He took a deep breath, the foul sweet smell growing stronger, and began to dig with his gloved hands. The earth was soft, yielding. A few inches down, his fingers brushed against something hard and smooth. Not a rock. He cleared away more dirt. It was bone, the curved, pale white of a human skull. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over him. He scrambled back, his heart pounding in his ears, a raw guttural sound escaping his lips. He had found him. After 20 years, he had found Ben Carter. He stared at the shallow grave, at the silent, accusing eye sockets of the skull, and the full weight of what he had uncovered crashed down on him. This was no accident. This was no hunting spot. This was a burial site. And the man who had marked this map, the man who had searched alongside him all those years ago, had known it all along. He hadn't been searching for a lost hiker. He had been checking on a grave. Elias Thorne, the man who found the lost, had just unearthed a murder. And as he stared into the darkness of that shallow grave, he had the sickening feeling that the killer, or someone who knew the killer's secret, was still out there. And that by finding this body, he had just made himself the new target. The cliffhanger wasn't just that he'd found the body. It was the chilling realization that the map was not an act of conscience, but a boast. It was a trophy, hidden in plain sight, a secret celebration of a perfect crime. And Elias had just stumbled into the victor's private collection. He was no longer a rescuer. He was a witness. And in the suffocating silence of Sorrow's Gulch, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was not alone. Clara Carter lived in the same small, tidy house she had shared with her son. The paint was peeling, and the garden was overgrown with weeds, but a single defiant rosebush bloomed by the front porch, its crimson petals a splash of vibrant life against the backdrop of decay. When Elias pulled up, she was sitting on the porch swing, a faded afghan over her lap, staring at nothing. She looked smaller than he remembered, as if the grief had physically whittled her away over the years, leaving only a fragile shell. He walked up the cracked concrete path, the old map tube clutched in his hand like a baton. He didn't know what he was going to say, how to deliver a blow that would shatter the fragile piece she had built for herself. He only knew he couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Not until he understood more. This was her story, her son. She deserved to hear it from him first. Mrs. Carter, he said softly. Her head turned slowly, her eyes pale and watery, taking a moment to focus on him. A flicker of recognition, then a deep, weary sadness. Mr. Thorne, she breathed, her voice like rustling leaves. It's not September yet. No, ma'am, it's not. He stood before her, a hulking, awkward figure in his dusty hiking clothes. Can I sit with you for a moment? She nodded, gesturing to the empty space beside her on the swing. He sat, the chains groaning in protest. For a long time, they said nothing, just swung gently back and forth. The rhythmic creak, the only sound between them. I'm selling my house, he said finally, needing to fill the silence. Moving into a smaller place. My daughter's idea. Change is hard, she whispered. Everything changes, but nothing really changes at all. She looked at the tube in his hand. What's that? This was it. He took a deep, steadying breath. It's a map. I found it in my attic. It's a map of the area where Ben went missing. Her hands tightened on the Afghan. She didn't look at him, but he could feel the sudden tension in her small frame. There were so many maps, she said, her voice flat. They covered the walls of that command center. I used to stare at them for hours, trying to will him to appear. This one is different, Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He untied the leather cord and unrolled the map across their laps. He pointed a trembling finger at the faded red X. This map has a mark on it, in a place called Sorrow's Gulch, and it's dated September 14, 2004. Clara stared at the X, her breath catching in her throat. Her face, already so pale, seemed to drain of all remaining color. She traced the lines of the ravine with a fingertip that was as thin and translucent as a moth's wing. Sorrow's Gulch, she repeated softly. Ben mentioned that place. He said he'd found something there, something special. He was so excited about it. He was going to show me when he got back. Her eyes lifted from the map to meet Elias's, and in their depths, he saw 20 years of unanswered questions, of gnawing uncertainty, of a mother's desperate, undying hope. What does it mean, Mr. Thorne? He couldn't lie to her. He couldn't soften the blow. She had lived with uncertainty for too long. I went there this morning, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I went to the spot. Marked on the map, he paused, the words catching in his throat. I found him, Clara. I found Ben. A sound escaped her, a terrible, broken sound that was half gasp, half sob. She didn't cry. The tears had run dry years ago. Instead, she seemed to fold in on herself, her body convulsing as if from a physical impact. He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, and felt the tremors that racked her tiny frame. He wasn't in the river, she whispered. The words, a statement, not a question. No, he was buried. The word hung in the air between them, ugly and final. Buried, not lost, not wandered off, buried. It was confirmation of her deepest, darkest fear. Her son hadn't been the victim of a tragic accident. He had been the victim of a monstrous act. She breathed, her voice barely audible. Who would do this? Elias showed her the surveyor's seal in the corner of the map. The map was made by a man named Jonathan Westhoff. He was on the search party with us. He died a couple of years ago. Westhoff, Clara repeated, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. The developer, he was always trying to buy up land around here. He wanted our property. Ben hated him. He said Westhoff was a cancer on the valley, destroying everything beautiful for a profit. She looked at Elias, a new, fierce light in her eyes, the light of a mother's rage, and his son, Marcus. He was in Ben's class. They were rivals, not just for grades, but for everything. The victim, Ben Carter. A bright, passionate, 20-year-old, an idealist who loved the wilderness and saw the beauty that men like Westhoff sought to pave over. He wasn't just a hiker. He was a defender of the land. He'd been organizing protests against Westhoff's latest development proposal, a luxury resort that would have destroyed a pristine wetland area. He had been a thorn in the side of a very powerful, very wealthy family. The antagonist, Jonathan Westhoff, the respected local businessman, the dedicated search volunteer. A man who had stood beside Elias, feigning concern, while holding the secret of Ben's grave in his heart. A man who had created a trophy of his crime, a private monument to his victory, and hidden it away. And now, his legacy of cruelty had passed to his son, Marcus. Marcus Westhoff was the living embodiment of his father's greed, but without the veneer of civility. Elias had seen him around town, driving his obscenely expensive sports car too fast, treating waitresses with casual disdain, radiating an aura of untouchable privilege. He had his father's ambition, but none of his patience. He was a predator in the making, or perhaps, one already made. There was a girl, Clara said suddenly, her mind sifting through the ashes of her memory. Ben was in love with her. Her name was Maya Lin. She worked at the diner downtown. She was beautiful, quiet. She left town right after. Right after Ben disappeared, no one ever heard from her again. The hidden witness. Maya Lin, a young woman caught between the idealistic boy she loved and the powerful family that may have destroyed him. Had she seen something? Had she been threatened? Her sudden departure was too convenient, another loose thread in a tapestry of lies. Elias felt the pieces clicking into place, forming a picture that was more horrifying than he could have imagined. This wasn't just a murder. It was a conspiracy. A secret buried not just in the cold earth of Sorrow's Gulch, but in the heart of their community. Ben hadn't just stumbled upon something special in that ravine. He had stumbled upon a secret that Westhoff was willing to kill to protect, and Maya was the only one left who might know what that secret was. We need to find her. Clara, Elias said, his voice firm, the old search and rescue commander taking over. We need to find Maya. He left Clara Carter's house with a new purpose. He was no longer just a man haunted by the past. He was an agent of its retribution. His first stop was the local library, its archives a dusty treasure trove of the town's history. He spent hours poring over old newspapers from the fall of 2004. The headlines were all about the search for Ben, filled with quotes from Jonathan Westhoff praising the community's efforts and offering his prayers for the Carter family. The hypocrisy made Elias's stomach turn. Then he found what he was looking for, a small article in the business section, dated a week after Ben's disappearance. Westhoff Development secures final permit for controversial Eagles Peak Resort. The article detailed how a last-minute environmental report had unexpectedly cleared the way for the project. A project Ben had been fighting tooth and nail. The key to the approval, the report stated, was the discovery of a new stable water source on the property, negating the concerns about the fragile wetland. The surveyor credited with the discovery was Jonathan Westhoff himself. Elias's blood ran cold. Sorrow's Gulch bordered the Westhoff property. What if the special thing Ben had found wasn't a beautiful view or a rare flower? What if it was proof that Westhoff's report was a fraud? What if Ben had discovered that the new water source was a fabrication, a lie designed to push the development through? He would have had the power to ruin Jonathan Westhoff. He had motive, and Westhoff had the means and the opportunity to silence him forever. The puzzle was almost complete. Ben discovers the fraud. He confronts Westhoff, or perhaps Westhoff's volatile son, Marcus. There's a struggle. Ben is killed. Panicked, they bury him in the ravine, a place they know is remote, a place they can control. Jonathan, the meticulous planner, creates the map, a private perverse record of his crime. Maya, Ben's girlfriend, either witnesses the murder, or Ben tells her what he's found just before he's killed. The Westhoffs threaten her, forcing her to flee, to disappear. For 20 years, the secret holds, until a grieving daughter forces her father to clean out his attic. Elias left the library and drove to the address listed for Marcus West. It was a monstrous glass and steel structure perched on a hillside overlooking the valley, a monument to arrogance. He didn't have a plan. He just needed to see him, to look into the eyes of the man who had likely inherited his father's sins. He found Marcus on the sprawling deck, a glass of whiskey in his hand, talking on his phone. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with his father's intense eyes and a permanent sneer etched on his lips. He radiated a dangerous energy, a coiled violence just beneath the expensive suit. Elias got out of his truck and walked to the edge of the property. Marcus ended his call, his eyes narrowing as he saw the old man standing there. "Can I help you?" Marcus called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "My name is Elias Thorne," Elias said, his voice steady. "I was the lead volunteer on the search for Ben Carter." The sneer on Marcus's face didn't falter, but something flickered in his eyes. A flicker of what annoyance? Or was it fear? "That was a long time ago," Marcus said, taking a sip of his whiskey. "Tragic accident, the river took him." "He wasn't found in the river," Elias said, letting the words hang in the air. He watched Marcus's face, searching for a crack in the polished facade. "I knew your father. He was on that search with me, a very dedicated man. He spent a lot of time in Sorrow's Gulch." Marcus went still. The hand holding the whiskey glass tightened, the knuckles turning white. The air crackled with a sudden, palpable tension. For a moment, Elias saw past the arrogant rich boy and saw the cornered animal underneath. "My father was a pillar of this community," Marcus said, his voice low and menacing. "Whatever you think you know, old man, you're wrong. You should have stayed in your dusty old house with your dusty old memories. Some things are better left buried." The threat was unmistakable. It was a confession, wrapped in a warning. Marcus knew he had been there. Or at least, he knew the truth of what his father had done. Elias had his antagonist. He had the shape of the crime. Now, he just needed the proof. He needed to find Maya Lin, because she was no longer just a hidden witness. She was the only person alive who could burn the Westhof's world to the ground. And as he turned and walked back to his truck, he felt Marcus's eyes on his back, cold and hard as granite. The hunt had begun again. But this time, Elias wasn't the searcher, he was the prey. The next few days were a blur of fear and frustration. Elias felt like he was walking with a target on his back. A black SUV, the same model as Marcus Westhof's, was parked down the street from his house every morning. It was a silent, constant reminder of Marcus's warning. Some things are better left buried. The message was clear: drop it, or you'll be buried. To the injustice of it all was a physical ache in his chest. A young man's life had been stolen, his body hidden in a shallow grave. His mother left to drown in a sea of unanswered questions. Also a greedy man could build his empire. And now, that man's son was using the same tactics of intimidation and fear to protect the family's dark secret. Sleep offered no escape. Elias's dreams were haunted by the image of Ben Carter's skull, the empty eye sockets staring at him from the dark earth. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, the silence of his house feeling as oppressive as the silence of Sorrow's Gulch. He was a man used to the clear, unambiguous dangers of the wilderness: a sudden storm, a grizzly bear, a hidden crevasse. This was different. This was a human evil, a patient, calculating cruelty that was far more terrifying than any force of nature. He focused his energy on finding Maya Lin. It was his only hope of breaking the stalemate. He started at the diner where she used to work. The place had changed hands 3 times since 2004. But he found a waitress who had been there for 30 years, a woman named Brenda, with a kind face and tired eyes. "Maya," Brenda said, her brow furrowing as she refilled his coffee cup. "Oh, I remember her, sweet girl, so quiet. Scared of her own shadow, it seemed like. She was head over heels for that Carter boy. When he went missing, it broke her. She came in for her last shift, white as a sheet, shaking like a leaf. She just said she had to go, that she couldn't stay here anymore. Packed her bags and was gone the next day. Never even picked up her last paycheck." "Did she say where she was going?" Elias asked, leaning forward. Brenda shook her head. "No, just away." But there was something else. The day she left, Marcus Westhoff came in here. He sat in her section, but he didn't order anything. He just watched her. The whole time, it was creepy. I asked her if he was bothering her, and she just shook her head, wouldn't look at me. When she left, he left. I always had a bad feeling about that. The story sent a chill down Elias's spine. It was a clear picture of intimidation. Marcus hadn't been there to say goodbye. He had been there to make sure she left. To make sure she kept her mouth shut. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. The Westhoffs hadn't just murdered Ben. They had terrorized a young woman, forcing her to abandon her life, to run and hide, to carry the burden of their secret. Elias felt a surge of protective anger. He had to find her, not just for Ben's sake, but for hers. He had to let her know she didn't have to be afraid anymore. His search turned into a digital manhunt. He spent hours online, running her name through every database he could think of. But Maya Lin was a common name. There were thousands of them across the country. He tried cross-referencing with age, with potential professions, but every lead was a dead end. It was as if she had intentionally erased herself, becoming a ghost. Meanwhile, Marcus's harassment escalated. One morning, Elias woke up to find The tires of his pickup truck slashed. There was no note, no message. Just the silent, violent statement. He called the sheriff, a man he'd known for years, but without any proof, there was nothing he could do. "It's probably just kids, Eli," the sheriff had said, his voice laced with a weary sympathy that bordered on pity. "You're under a lot of stress with the move. Maybe you're just seeing things." Elias felt a profound sense of isolation. The town he had served for 40 years now saw him as a crazy old man. The system he had trusted was failing him. He was alone in this fight, a single, aging warrior against the powerful, corrupt dynasty. The power imbalance was staggering. He had the truth, but they had the money, the influence, the ability to bend the world to their will. He went to see Clara Carter, needing to draw strength from her quiet resilience. He found her in her overgrown garden, methodically pulling weeds, her movements slow but determined. He told her about the slashed tires, about the dead ends in his search for Maya. She listened patiently, her hands never ceasing their work. When he was done, she looked up at him, her pale eyes clear and steady. "They want you to be afraid, Mr. Thorne. Fear is the only weapon they have. It's what they used on Maya. It's what they're trying to use on you. Don't let them win." She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. This was Ben's. He gave it to Maya for her birthday, just before she gave it back to me the day she left. She said she couldn't keep it, that it would be safer with me. She opened the locket. On one side was a tiny, smiling photo of Ben. On the other, a picture of Maya, her dark eyes full of a soft, gentle light. But it wasn't the photos that caught Elias's attention. Tucked behind Maya's picture was a tiny, folded piece of paper. His heart pounded as Clara carefully extracted it with a pair of tweezers. It was a receipt from a photo developing shop in a small town called Astoria on the Oregon coast. The date on the receipt was September 13, 2004. The day before Ben disappeared. He was going to surprise her, Clara whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. He had taken a roll of film of the two of them, of the places they loved. He drove all the way to the coast to get it developed at a special shop he liked. He was going to put the best picture in the locket for her. Astoria, a small, sleepy, fishing town hundreds of miles away. A place to disappear. A place to start over. It was a long shot, a 20-year-old breadcrumb, but it was the only one he had. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Elias packed a small bag, left a note for his daughter saying he was going on one last camping trip, and pointed his repaired pickup truck west. The black SUV was parked in its usual spot as he drove out of town. This time, he didn't look in the rearview mirror. He was done being the prey. He was going on the offensive. The drive to Astoria took 2 days. With every mile he put between himself and the Bitterroots, he felt the oppressive weight of Marcus Westhoff's surveillance begin to lift. He was entering a new territory, a new chapter of the story. Astoria was a town caught between the mountains and the sea, shrouded in a perpetual mist. It felt like a place where secrets could be kept. He found the Photoshop from the receipt. It was still there, a small, cluttered store run by a friendly, bearded man who introduced himself as Gus. Elias showed him the photo of Maya from the locket. "I'm looking for this woman," he said. "She might have been here a long time. Ego, her name is Maya Lin." Gus studied the photo, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Maya," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, I remember her. She came in here 20 years ago, looking for a job, said she was a photographer. I couldn't hire her, but I let her use my darkroom sometimes. She was good. Really good. Had a great eye. Is she still here?" Elias asked, his heart leaping. "No, she left years ago. But she comes back to visit sometimes. She has a gallery now, up in Seattle. Calls herself Maya Silver. Said she wanted a name that reflected the light she was trying to capture. Seattle." He was close, so close. Gus gave him the name of the gallery. It was called Chasing Light. Elias thanked him, his mind reeling. Maya hadn't just disappeared. She had reinvented herself. She had taken her pain and her fear and transformed it into art. She was a survivor. The drive to Seattle was filled with a nervous anticipation. What would he say to her? Would she even talk to him? Or would the sight of a stranger from her past send her running again? He found the gallery in a trendy, artsy neighborhood. The space was bright and airy, the walls covered with stunning black and white photographs of the Pacific Northwest. They were hauntingly beautiful, full of mist and shadow, and a profound sense of solitude. It was the work of someone who understood the wilderness, but also its capacity for darkness. And then he saw her. She was standing in the middle of the gallery, talking to a customer. She was older, of course, her face etched with lines of experience and a sadness that her smile couldn't quite hide. But it was her. The same dark, intelligent eyes, the same quiet grace. Majalina Majasilber. He waited until the customer left, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked towards her, the old map tube, feeling heavier than ever in his hand. "Maya," he said softly. She turned, a polite, professional smile on her face. Then her eyes met his, and the smile vanished. The color drained from her face. The fear that Brenda had described 20 years ago was back, stark and raw. She knew who he was. Or at least, she knew that he represented the past she had tried so desperately to escape. "Who are you?" she whispered, though her eyes told him she already knew the answer. "My name is Alias Thorne," he said gently. "I knew Ben Carter. I led the search for him." He held out the map. "And I think I know what happened to him." Her eyes widened in terror. She took a step back, shaking her head, a choked sob escaping her lips. "No," she whispered. "Please, you have to go. You can't be here." "I found him," Maya Elias pressed, his voice full of a gentle urgency. "I know he was murdered. And I know the Westhofs did it. You're the only one who can help me prove it. You don't have to be afraid anymore." "You don't understand," she cried, her voice cracking. "You have no idea what they're capable of. They'll destroy you. They'll destroy everything you love. They told me what they would do if I ever talked." The terror in her eyes was absolute. The conflict he saw there was a war that had been raging for 2 decades, the war between her fear and her conscience. Between her love for Ben and her instinct for self-preservation. The injustice was escalating. No longer a secret, buried in the dirt, but a living, breathing monster that had stalked this woman for half her life. And Elias knew, with a sickening certainty, that by finding her, he hadn't just found a witness, he had put her directly in the path of the storm. Maya's gallery was her sanctuary, a world of light and shadow that she could control. Elias's presence shattered that illusion, dragging the darkness of the past into her carefully constructed present. She backed away from him, her hands raised as if to ward off a physical blow. "Please, leave," she begged, her voice trembling. "You don't know what you're doing." "I know a boy was murdered," Elias said, his voice firm but gentle, refusing to be pushed away. "I know his mother has lived in hell for 20 years. And I know you've been living in a prison of fear. It's time for it to end." He unrolled the surveyor's map on a nearby table, the faded red X, a stark accusation against the parchment. "Jonathan Westhoff made this. He was on the search party with me. He stood there, day after day, and watched us search in all the wrong places, knowing exactly where Ben's body was. This map wasn't a mistake. It was a trophy." Maya stared at the map, her breath coming in ragged hitches. The sight of it seemed to break through her wall of fear, touching a deeper well of grief and rage. "A trophy," she repeated, the words laced with a venom that surprised Elias. "Yes, that's what Ben was to them, a trophy." She sank onto a stool, her body seeming to deflate. The story she had held inside for 2 decades began to pour out of her, a torrent of memory and pain. "Ben knew they were lying," she began, her eyes fixed on a distant point, reliving the last days of his life. "He was an amateur geologist, you know. He loved rocks, the earth. He knew that land better than anyone. When Westhoff's report came out about the new water source that would allow them to build their ugly resort, Ben knew it was impossible. The water table in that area was too low. He said Westhoff must have faked the data. She described how Ben had spent days hiking the area around Sorrows Gulch, which bordered the proposed development. He was looking for proof. And he found it. He found the original survey markers from the 1950s, buried under a pile of rocks. He used his GPS, took dozens of photos. The markers proved that the land Westhoff was claiming as his own. The land with the supposed spring was actually part of the national forest. He hadn't just faked the water data. He had illegally moved the boundary markers to claim the land for himself. The resort, his entire legacy, was built on a lie. The plot twist landed with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about a fraudulent report. It was about a massive land grab, a crime that would have not only made Westhoff a fortune, but also defrauded the public. Ben hadn't just stumbled upon a lie. He'd uncovered a conspiracy that went to the very heart of the Westhoff empire. He was so excited. Maya continued, tears streaming down her face now. He thought he had them. He called me from the trail, his voice buzzing. He said, "I've got him, May. The bastard is finished." He was going to go to the Forest Service, to the newspapers. He had a folder with all the proof, the photos, the GPS coordinates, copies of the original land surveys he'd gotten from the county records office. Her voice dropped to a whisper. He told me he was going to confront them first. He was young and idealistic. He wanted to see the look on Jonathan Westhoff's face when he knew he'd been caught. I begged him not to. I told him to just go to the authorities, but he wouldn't listen. He was so sure of himself. That was the last time she ever spoke to him. The next day, he was reported missing. 2 days later, as the search was in full swing, Marcus Westhoff appeared at her door. He didn't have to say anything, Maya said, her body trembling with the memory. He just looked at me. The way he looked at me, it was like I was nothing, an insect, he said. Ben's gone. A tragic accident. Then he looked around my little apartment and said, "It would be a shame if something happened to you, too. Or your parents back in California. A fire, maybe." Accidents happen all the time. The cruelty was breathtaking. They hadn't just killed Ben, they had systematically and sadistically dismantled his world. And then he asked me for the folder. Maya whispered he knew Ben would have told me about it. I was so scared I could barely breathe. I gave it to him. I gave him everything. The photos, the surveys, everything Ben had died for, and Marcus just smiled. He told me it was best for everyone if I just disappeared. He gave me $5,000 in cash and told me to be on a bus by morning. She had been running ever since. The money, the new name, the gallery, it was all built on a foundation of fear and silence. She had convinced herself she was a survivor, but now, in the stark light of Elias's revelation, she saw herself for what she was, a prisoner. Elias felt a white-hot rage burn through him. The sheer, calculated evil of it all was staggering. Jonathan, the mastermind, and Marcus, the enforcer. They had committed the perfect crime, not just by hiding a body, but by erasing the evidence and terrorizing the only witness into silence. "The folder is gone," Maya said, her voice hollow. "There's no proof. It's my word against one of the most powerful men in the state." "Maybe not," Elias said, his mind racing. He thought of the receipt from the Photoshop in Astaria. "Clara told me Ben had a roll of film developed. Pictures of the two of you. The receipt was from the day before he disappeared. Did he ever pick them up?" Maya's eyes widened. "No," she breathed. "He was supposed to get them on his way back from the mountains. He was going to put one in the locket." Oh my God. The folder. The folder had copies. But the originals, the photos he took of the survey markers, they were on that roll of film, the clue. The hidden evidence that had been sitting in a box in a dusty Photoshop for 20 years. It was the bombshell they needed. The physical proof that would corroborate Maya's story and expose the Westhoff's entire criminal enterprise. The stakes had just shifted from a private quest for justice to a public scandal that could bring down an empire. "We have to go back," Elias said, his voice charged with a new energy. "We have to get that film." But as he spoke, a shadow fell across the gallery doorway. Both he and Maya looked up, their blood running cold. It was Marcus Westhoff. He wasn't sneering anymore. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He must have had a tail on Elias, must have followed him all the way to Seattle. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Marcus said, his voice dangerously calm. He wasn't looking at Elias, he was looking at Maya, his eyes full of a chilling possessiveness. "You've been a very bad girl, Maya. Leaving town without saying goodbye. Making new friends." He took a step into the gallery, his presence sucking all the air out of the room. He was flanked by two large, thuggish-looking men in dark suits. The time for veiled threats and slashed tires was over. This was a direct, brutal confrontation. "It's over," Marcus, Elias said, stepping between him and Maya. "I found the body. And we know everything." Marcus laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You found some old bones, old man. And she's a hysterical woman who ran out on her boyfriend. Nobody will believe you." He took another step forward. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, where is the film?" The question confirmed it. He knew. His father must have known Ben was a photographer, must have realized the risk of the photos after the murder. They hadn't just been looking for the folder. They had been looking for the negatives, the one piece of evidence they couldn't control. And now, 20 years later, that loose end had come back to haunt them. "You're not getting it," Maya said, her voice shaking but defiant. She stood up, her fear being replaced by a spark of the same fire that had burned in Ben. "You're not burying his memory. Not again." Marcus's face twisted in a snarl of rage. "You stupid bitch," he hissed, lunging for her. Elias reacted on pure instinct. He was 72 years old, but 40 years of hauling gear and people through the mountains had kept him strong. He shoved Maya out of the way and brought the heavy rolled-up map down with all his force on Marcus's outstretched arm. There was a sickening crack, and Marcus screamed. A high-pitched sound of pain and fury. The two thugs moved in, but Elias was already shouting at Maya, "Go! Get out of here, call the police." Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes wide with terror. Then she turned and fled through the back door of the gallery. One of the thugs started after her, but Elias blocked his path, swinging the map tube like a club. The other man grabbed him from behind, his arm wrapping around Elias's throat, squeezing the air from his lungs. Black spots danced in Elias's vision. He could hear Marcus cursing, cradling his broken arm. The pressure on his throat tightened. "This is it," he thought. "This is how it ends." But as his consciousness began to fade, he saw not the face of his attacker, but the pale, watery eyes of Clara Carter and the defiant bloom of her single rosebush. He had made a promise. He couldn't break it now. With a final, desperate surge of adrenaline, he stomped down hard on his attacker's instep and drove his elbow back into the man's ribs. The grip loosened for a second, just long enough for Elias to suck in a ragged breath. At that exact moment, the sound of sirens filled the air, growing closer with every second. Marcus's face went pale. "Get out!" He screamed at his men. "Go!" They dropped Elias to the floor and scrambled out the front of the gallery, helping their injured boss into a waiting car, which sped off just as the first police cruiser rounded the corner. Elias lay on the floor, gasping for air, his body bruised and aching. The gallery was in disarray, a battlefield of shattered art and exposed secrets. But as Maya rushed back in, her phone still clutched in her hand, he managed a weak, triumphant smile. The tension had been cranked to its absolute maximum. The conspiracy was out in the open. They had the motive, the witness, and the knowledge of the proof. The fight was no longer hidden in the shadows. It was about to become very, very public. And the Westhoffs, for the first time in their lives, were on the run. The cinematic payoff didn't come in a hail of bullets or a fiery explosion. It came in the sterile, silent confines of a courtroom, under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. The arrest of Marcus Westhoff for assault at Maya's gallery had been the crack in the dam. With the police now involved, Ilias and Maya were able to give official statements, and the story of Ben Carter's disappearance was finally reclassified as a homicide investigation. The discovery of the film negatives in the Astoria Photoshop was the flood that broke the dam completely. The photos were damning. There were a dozen sharp, clear images of the original survey markers half buried in the earth, with Ben's GPS unit in the frame showing the exact coordinates. There were shots of the surrounding landscape, proving the location was deep within the boundaries of the national forest. And there were close-ups of the dry, cracked earth where Jonathan Westhoff had claimed to find a bubbling spring. It was an irrefutable, point-by-point dismantling of the lie upon which the Westhoff fortune was built. The trial became a national media sensation. The hiker's grave, the tabloids called it. It was a story with all the elements of a viral obsession, a cold case, a murdered idealist, a corrupt dynasty, a hidden witness, and a grizzled old hero. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters and spectators, all hungry for the drama. Marcus Westhoff, his arm in a designer sling, sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief. He had the best lawyers money could buy, who painted Maya as a jilted, unstable lover and Elias as a senile old man with a vendetta. They argued that the photos were meaningless, that the land dispute was a civil matter, completely unrelated to Ben Carter's accidental death. The prosecution's case was built around Maya's testimony. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. Dressed in a simple black dress, she looked small and fragile, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. She told the story of her love for Ben, of his passion for the wilderness, of his discovery. She recounted, in chilling detail, Marcus's visit to her apartment, the veiled threats, the fear that had kept her silent for 20 years. Westhoff's lawyer was brutal in his cross-examination. He sneered, he condescended, he twisted her words, trying to paint her as a liar. "Isn't it true, Ms. Lynn, that you were jealous of Mr. Carter's dedication to his causes? Isn't it true that you fought, that he was leaving you, and that you concocted this fantasy out of spite?" Maya never wavered. She looked directly at the jury, her eyes filled with a sad, steady conviction. "I loved Ben Carter," she said, her voice ringing with truth, "and Marcus Westhoff took him from me. He and his father murdered him to protect their lies. I was a coward for 20 years. I'm not a coward anymore." The turning point, the moment of pure cinematic justice, came when the prosecutor called his final witness, Elias Thorne. He walked to the stand slowly, his old bones aching. But his resolve was like iron. He placed a hand-drawn surveyor's map on the witness box, the faded red X facing the jury. He told his story simply, without embellishment. He spoke of the search, of his 40 years in the mountains, of finding the map in his attic. He described the cold dread he felt when he saw the date, the descent into Sorrow's Gulch, the smell of death, the moment his fingers touched the cold, hard bone of Ben's skull. "This map," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority that commanded the room, "was made by Jonathan Westhoff, a man I trusted, a man who stood beside me and pretended to search for a boy he had already buried. This map is not a chart of the wilderness, it is a chart of a man's corrupted soul." Then, the prosecutor asked the question that would seal Marcus's fate. "Mr. Thorne, you said you found this map in your attic. Do you have any idea how it got there?" "For a long time, I didn't," Elias said. "It was a mystery. But, as I was packing up my wife's odd things, I found a box of her journals." He paused, his gaze drifting to Clara Carter, who sat in the front row, clutching the silver locket in her hand. "My wife, Maria, was a real estate agent. She was a good, honest woman. But she worked, for a short time, for Westhoff Development, back before we knew what kind of man he was." He pulled a small leather-bound journal from his jacket pocket. In an entry dated October 2004, a month after Ben's disappearance, "My wife wrote about a meeting she had with Jonathan West. He was paranoid," she wrote. "Obsessed with the idea that someone might have seen something. He was particularly worried about me, because I had led the search and knew the area so well." Elias opened the journal. I'll read her words. Jonathan came by the house today. He gave me a tube, a map, he said. A gift for Elias, for all his hard work on the search. He said it was a special private survey of the area. He was acting so strangely, I felt a chill. I didn't want to give it to Elias. I didn't trust Jonathan's intentions. So I put it in the old crate in the attic. I'll give it to him, someday, maybe. Or maybe I'll just let it be forgotten. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with a resounding crash. The map wasn't just a trophy, it was a plant, a piece of planted evidence. Jonathan Westhoff, in his paranoid, arrogant brilliance, had tried to frame Elias. He had given the map to Maria, knowing that if the body were ever found, the map would be discovered in Elias's house, making him the prime suspect. It was the ultimate act of cruel, calculated insurance. He would have gotten away with murder and framed the hero who tried to find his victim. Marcus Westhoff's face went ashen. The mask of arrogance shattered, revealing the panicked, cornered rat underneath. He lunged to his feet, screaming, "He's lying. The old man is lying." But it was too late. The jury saw the truth. The public saw the truth. The poetic twist of fate was complete. The very tool Jonathan Westhoff had designed to be his final, perfect defense had become the instrument of his son's destruction, brought to light by the wife who had instinctively distrusted him, and the husband who had sworn to find the truth. The verdict was swift. Guilty. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty of a litany of fraud and land charges that would dismantle the Westhoff empire forever. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his face a contorted mask of rage and disbelief, his eyes met Elias's for a fleeting second, and in that moment, Elias saw not a monster, but a pathetic, broken man, crushed under the weight of his father's sins. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed. Clara Carter collapsed into Maya's arms, sobbing the tears that had been denied to her for 2 decades. Elias stood, his hand resting on his wife's journal, and felt a profound, quiet sense of peace. Justice, like a hidden spring, had finally broken through the hard, cold earth. The public exposure was total, the revenge absolute. The emotional catharsis, a wave that washed over them all, cleansing the long, dark shadow of the past. The first snow of winter was falling, dusting the peaks of the Bitterroots in a blanket of white. The air was sharp and clean, the silence of the mountains no longer oppressive, but peaceful. Elias stood with Clara and Maya on a small, sun-drenched ridge overlooking Sorrow's Gulch. They had not returned to the grave itself. That was a place of darkness. This was a place of light. In front of them was a simple, hand-carved wooden bench. Elias had made it himself from the wood of a lightning-felled pine. On the back of the bench, he had carved a single line, Ben Carter, 1984 to 2004. He loved this wildness, and fought to protect it. It was a memorial, not a grave marker. A place to remember the life, not the death. Clara ran her gloved hand over the inscription, a faint, sad smile on her lips. She was still fragile, but the brittle, haunted look was gone from her eyes. In its place was a quiet acceptance, a peace that had been a stranger for 20 years. "It's beautiful, Elias," she said, her voice soft. "He would have liked this." Maya stood a little apart, her camera in her hand. She had not taken any pictures. She was just looking, breathing in the cold mountain air, letting the landscape wash over her. The trial had been an ordeal, but it had also been a liberation. She had faced her monster, and won. She was no longer Maya Silva, the woman hiding behind a new name. She was Maya Linnigan, the woman who had loved Ben Carter, the survivor who had found her voice. She planned to stay, to open a small gallery and workshop in town. To teach kids how to find the beauty in the world through a camera lens. She was finally home. The three of them stood in silence for a long time. A strange, makeshift family forged in tragedy and bound by the pursuit of truth. They were 3 different people, from 3 different worlds, their lives irrevocably altered by a single, violent act. The cost of the truth had been immense. A young life lost, a mother's heart broken, a woman's youth stolen by fear, an old man's peace shattered. The scars would always be there, a haunting reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their quiet little town. "I'm selling the house," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I'm moving to the coast. To be near the ocean, a new view." Elias nodded. He understood. He was moving too, not to a smaller house, but to a small cabin he had bought deep in the woods, far from town, where the only neighbors were the pines and the stars. He needed the quiet, the solitude. He had spent his life searching for others. Now, it was time to just be. "Will you be all right?" Maya asked him, her eyes full of a genuine, gentle concern. "I'll be fine," he said, and he knew it was true. He was old, he was tired, and he was bruised. But he was not broken. He had honored his promise to Clara. He had given Ben a voice. He had brought a hidden truth into the light. That was a legacy he could live with. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow-covered valley, they turned to leave. Elias took one last look back at the bench, a simple, solitary object against the vast, indifferent wilderness. The emotional echo of the past 20 years would linger here. In the whisper of the wind through the pines, in the cold silence of the snow, it was a bittersweet healing, a quiet, somber peace earned at a terrible price. The story was over, the ghosts at rest, but the mountains would remember. The mountains always remember.